A couple of weeks ago, we saw that part of Jesus's task on earth was to confront the corruption in institutions, especially institutions that claim to represent God. This week, we're beginning what you might call a mini series on that same theme. Jesus spends Matthew chapter 23 taking the Pharisees to task. And our job is to figure out what it is that he's really getting at. Now, I want you to ask yourself a question. Why the Pharisees? Why does Jesus spend so much time and effort going after the Pharisees when he could have been going after the Herodians or the Sadducees? These groups in first century Judaism that were really responsible for the corruption in Israel's religious and political life. At least that's the story that we're told by Josephus and other sources. Why does Jesus spend so much time taking to task a group of people who, it seems from the historical evidence that we have, really were trying to be faithful to Scripture? Really were trying to live in accordance with God's law. We have to ruminate on that question. It's not going to come to us immediately, but we have to ruminate on that question in order to really understand what it is that Jesus is getting at in Matthew chapter 23 and why it is important for us. So like we so often do, we need to set the stage for this encounter, this conflict, if you will, between Jesus and the Pharisees. And you might include too what the NIV calls the teachers of the law, the scribes, older translations render it. And we do that by taking our cues from the way that Matthew structures his gospel. Now, let's remind ourselves of that structure. There are three parts to Matthew's gospel. There's an introduction, there's a body, and there's a conclusion. And the body constitutes most of the gospel. That's chapter 5 through chapter 25. And the body is divided into 9 sections. Now, what's really important for us to observe is that we are now entering the last of those 9 sections. We might talk about this a little bit more in a later sermon, but this section has been the source of some scholarly discussion. Is it one discourse or two? How does this exactly work? The way that I can construct this is that it is 2 discourses that are inextricably intertwined with one another. You have the public discourse of chapter 23, and then you have a more private discourse of chapters 24 and 25. Now, why does Matthew structure the gospel this way? What is he trying to accomplish? Well, the first thing that he's wanting to do is he's wanting to draw Jesus' public ministry to a close. And that's exactly what he does in chapter 23. So we need to pay special attention to what's happening here. But there's another purpose too. In drawing this public ministry to a close, Matthew is turning our attention backwards to everything that Jesus has done and taught throughout his gospel. Now we'll turn to that reminder more explicitly here in just a moment. But I want also for us to remember the explicit context of this teaching that Jesus gives to his disciples and to the crowds in chapter 23. Remember, Jesus has already been in significant public conflict with the Pharisees and the scribes, and actually with the entire religious aristocracy of Jerusalem for more than a chapter and a half. It begins basically actually even while Jesus enters the temple, right? We talked about that. You've got these Pharisees and other people saying to Jesus, hey, wait a minute. Don't you hear what these kids are saying about you? And Jesus is like, yeah. And then they come back the next day and they say, who gave you the authority to do all this anyway? And so it begins. And then Jesus starts telling parables against these same people. That's what's happening in, the second half of chapter 21 and the first third of chapter 22. And then in the rest of chapter 22, each of the schools, the major groups, political and social groups, except the Essenes, because they weren't anywhere around. They were hiding out in the desert. But the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians all take their turn challenging Jesus. And in fact, it makes for some strange bedfellows, because the first challenge comes from the Herodians and the Pharisees, who were almost certainly on opposite sides of most Israelite political issues of the day. So this is sort of the narrative context. So we're not surprised, or at least we shouldn't be surprised, that Jesus takes these folks to task. But again, understanding the way Matthew structures his gospel is not enough if we're going to really make sense of what Jesus is doing here. We also have to remember what Jesus has already taught. Now, we're not going to go through this list in detail. That might be a whole other sermon. But we do want to touch on a few of these things so that we really get a flavor for what's going on here. Go all the way back to the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Think about what's happening in Matthew 5, 3 through 10. You have these beatitudes, these blessings. But Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who are wealthy, either actually wealthy or metaphorically wealthy. No. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. He doesn't say, blessed are the strong, those who can get their way, those who can make things happen. He says, blessed are the gentle. Blessed are the meek. He doesn't say, blessed are those who are already righteous. No. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Again, he doesn't say, blessed are the victorious. He says, blessed are the peacemakers. What's he doing here? What is Jesus trying to say? Well, there's lots of things he's trying to say, of course, but what he's really trying to say, at least for our purposes, as we're thinking forward into his teaching, is that the kingdom of God is for those who recognize and acknowledge their need. Now, of course, we could sort of just appeal to Paul and say, well, he's saying this because, nobody's actually righteous. In an absolute sense, that's true. And I actually think that Matthew, at least at some level, shares Paul's conviction on that point. But I think that Jesus is actually doing something far more radical. He is reconstruing being a righteous, good, faithful devotee of God in terms of recognizing one's insufficiency, recognizing one's inadequacy. It's not about us coming to God with our resume of accomplishments. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about 7:21 through 34. No, it's about us coming to God with our needs. Now, that gives us kind of a taste of what's going on here. Remember what happens in chapter 6. Jesus says that the kingdom rewards those who practice their faith with sincerity. That's all that, don't pray or fast or do your good deeds to be seen by other people. Do it in secret. He undermines and even overthrows, you would say, the whole status comparison game. That's the upshot of the whole do not judge bit. Because what is judging all about except saying that, well, actually, I'm superior to you because you have this problem in your life. Then in chapter 16, we beat this horse to death. Jesus says that in order to be a disciple of the Messiah, you have to lay aside your agenda, your desires, and trust God with your well-being. In chapters 18 and 19, Jesus says that the kingdom values and protects the vulnerable, in this case represented by children. And Jesus is, I would say, both explicit and emphatic about his value for, and I would even say love for, children. You remember what happened in chapter 20. You've got all of this status competition among the disciples, and Jesus turns to them and explicitly says, no, this is not how the kingdom works. The kingdom is not about you promoting yourself. The kingdom is about service and sacrifice. That may be the most important background for our text this morning. Well, that and chapter 22, verses 34 through 40, where love for God and for neighbor is construed as the most important obligation of a citizen of the kingdom. Now, why did I run you through this whole list of what Jesus has taught in Matthew's telling of his story? fact, we could have put more things on the list. Why did I run you through this list of things that you've seen before? Because I'm convinced that when we see this list, when we get it before us, when we really reflect upon it, then the content of Jesus' objection to the Pharisees' behavior will not be a surprise to us. It still might be a surprise that it applies to the Pharisees, but it won't be a surprise that this is what bothers Jesus. And let's turn to that content now. What is the content of the charges that Jesus lays at the feet of the Pharisees and the scribes? What is Jesus castigating them for? Well, verse 4 summarizes it nicely as hypocrisy. They don't do what they preach. But Jesus, in verses 5 through 7, unpacks what that hypocrisy looks like. It looks like indifference in ministry. Look there in verse 5, you see this beautiful descriptive image. They tie up heavy loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they won't lift a finger to move them themselves. They're really good at teasing out the exact obligations of the law. But not only do they not do those things themselves, they find ways around them, having to do them, but they don't help other people who are struggling, who are weak, who are suffering. Remember what Jesus said, back in chapter 11. Come to me, all of you who are heavily burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When we talked about that passage, we talked about how almost incomprehensible it is that Jesus says that, because he spends like the final 2/3 of chapter 5 radicalizing the law, making the obligations of the law more difficult, more onerous. And yet, as we've gone on, what we can see is that Jesus' yoke is easy and his burden is light, because he is not indifferent in ministry. He is not indifferent to our struggles. He is not indifferent to our pain. He is not indifferent to our weakness. Now, in verse 6, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for the insincerity of their worship. Now, let's be clear that we kind of understand what's happening here. Phylacteries, which that's the word that the NIV uses and that most modern translations use, are these pouches or even boxes that people would tie to their hand and their head, and they would contain scripture verses in sort of literalistic obedience to the commands of Deuteronomy. And then, of course, you've got these tassels on the garment that represent prayer. But here's the thing. You can do those things in a way that is inconspicuous, or you can do them in a way that is conspicuous. A way that tells the whole world, look what I'm doing. Look how sincere my worship of God is. Remember, of course, prayer is an act of worship. It's an act of devotion to God. So, they're doing the very opposite of what Jesus tells them to do in chapter 6. They are making a public show of their religious devotion, of their worship, and in so doing, that is, in proclaiming the sincerity of their worship, they are actually showing the world that it is not sincere. I remember I had a friend who sat on a search committee for a worship minister one time. And they were interviewing this candidate, and the more that he talked, the more that he seemed both dishonest and insincere. He bragged about the hours that he spent in prayer every morning and other acts of devotion. And after a while, the committee members began to look at each other and go, there's not enough time in the day, because he was also a PhD student at the time. It just didn't seem to make any sense. You've probably had those kinds of experiences. Fortunately, ones that egregious are pretty rare, but we can all be tempted to try and win favor with others through a show of our devotion. And that's because of this third charge that Jesus lays at the feet of these Pharisees and these scribes. They are obsessed with status. They love the seats of honor, I should say, in the synagogues. They love the seats of honor at banquets. They love being greeted in elaborate ways. They love being called rabbi. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like to think of my worship as insincere. But when it comes to this charge, sometimes I just have to raise my hand and say, guilty. Sometimes I do love being called doctor or reverend or pastor. Sometimes I do want people to recognize the work that I have put in to be devoted to God. We are all humans. We want each other's respect. And perhaps that respect is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is so easy, once we get a taste of it, to live for it. Sometimes the people who are the most persnickety, you might say, about you using their title are those who've just gotten one, because they are aware of all the hard work they put into it. But here's the really perverse part. At other times, the people who are the most obsessed with titles, obsessed with status, obsessed with who they are and putting on airs are those who have not earned it. I remember when I was in seminary, there was a church on Seminary Drive, not far from the campus. And that church had on its billboard, or maybe even on the side of the building, the pastor's name. And it was Dr. so-and-so, PhD. Now, if you know anything about academic etiquette, you know you can use the title, you can use the letters after the name. You're not supposed to use both. It is a dead giveaway that somebody got their degree out of a mail order catalog, and that it was about the status, not the learning. So these are the charges that Jesus lays at the feet of those who were in charge of God's people. But then in verses 8 through 10, he moves on to do something else. And in fact, he even emphasizes the point through the principles that he lays out in verses 11 and 12. Jesus is presenting a radically different vision of religious life. Don't let anyone call you rabbi. Don't let anyone call you father. Don't let anyone call you... Now, that third word there in verse 10, that's a little bit hard to translate. It could mean teacher or instructor. Unfortunately, that's also what rabbi means. But it's not the normal word for that. It can also mean leader. So in other words, what is Jesus doing here? He's saying, don't let people call you these titles that confer status and therefore power. He is explicitly delegitimizing the aristocratic vision of the religious life. One that is, yes, based on status. One that operates through power. One that focuses on systems, on making sure that you do things the right way and get things in order exactly as they are supposed to be. And one that benefits the elite. No. For Jesus, the vision of the religious life that we are supposed to embrace is based upon a recognition of the unique status of God and of the unique role played by the Messiah. Only God has the absolute authority of being your Father. Only the Messiah can lead you into the kingdom. Only the Messiah deserves to be your rabbi. By the way, that word rabbi, of course, is translated regularly in the New Testament as teacher, but it also had the connotation of master. We might say boss. This is a system that operates through humility. It is a vision of the religious life that operates on the basis of humility. Now, it's interesting. Wouldn't this status-based system operate, on humility? You're recognizing people's... No, actually, the weird part is, no. The aristocratic system brings out the worst impulses in us. It causes us to try to find some little bit of public acclaim for our self-worth that then we can use as a lever to exercise power over others. No, that's not how Jesus' system works. For Jesus, it is about humility. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't ever exercise power. It doesn't mean that we don't ever exercise authority. Okay, Jesus was clearly authoritative, and he had conveyed authority upon his apostles, his disciples. Now it is interesting, again, Matthew only calls them apostles once. And I think that's intentional. Matthew has this vision in mind, okay? I'm just reminding us that there will be instances where we are to exercise authority, but that's not how this system operates. Why? Because it is focused on relationships. Look back up there at verse 8. Do not call anyone rabbi, for you only have one rabbi, and you are all brothers. You are all sisters. You all, as N.T. Wright translates it, belong to one family. It's about the relationships that people have with one another. That's what this religious life is about. It is about us living as family under a single authority, the authority of God. An authority that is always benevolent. And so that authority benefits everyone, not just the elite. It's interesting. I've read this text for years, and it's always struck me how truly egalitarian this text is. But it's even more radical than that. This text, especially in the world in which it was originally offered, this text overturned so many of the values and the mechanisms that made ancient society work. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, what would this text say to us? Well, I think one place that we might begin is that practicing religion for our own purposes is always a dangerous undertaking. It's always a dangerous undertaking. It distorts so much of what we are supposed to be about. Distorts our understanding of the very truth that we claim anyway, we are trying to defend. There are lots of people in our world who claim to be dedicated to the scriptures, who claim to be dedicated to lofty concepts like inerrancy. While their lives demonstrate that they pick and choose what they want to hear from the Bible just as much as anyone else. And the thing is, we can be blind to that. Why? Because since we don't understand who God is or what He is about, we also misunderstand His values, the things that He thinks are important. So while we're looking here and here and here for all the stuff that we think God will treasure, we miss the things that are actually essential. And we value things that God knows are not worth our time or our energy. And actually, that fact should turn our hearts again to what we talked about last week. You see, love for God and love for neighbor is not simply an ethical command. It is the foundation, the necessary foundation for saving faith. And it is the only lens through which we can accurately see God, the world, and ourselves. So let us lay aside the well-worn habit of using our faith for our own benefit. Whether it be to win favor with the people in our church so that they think we're something special, or whether it be to win accounts for our business, or whether it be to win the hearts of girls. Let's lay aside this well-worn habit of using our faith for our own benefit. And let's turn our hearts again to loving God and loving one another.